Good afternoon, I'm Ntokozo Khumalo. Thank you for joining me for this week's Business Wrap. And for the week that was, Ford Motor Company is celebrated 100 years in South Africa, with Ilana Ford, the great-granddaughter of the automaker's founder, Henry Ford, being a special guest at its headquarters in Silverton, where it announced a 5.2 billion rand investment. So we'll recap some of those details around that investment a little bit later on in the segment. And then as the year wraps up, African and European business leaders gathered in Melrose Arch, Johannesburg, on the tail end of the week for the 10th annual Southern Africa-Europe CEOs Dialogue to examine business and trade relations on the back of intensifying geopolitical tensions. The Gauteng Growth and Development Agency partnered in the dialogue and has been a key partner in several engagements such as BRICS, AGOA, and the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. We will have the agency's acting group CEO, Saki Zamkaga, with us in studio a little bit later on for that conversation around Gauteng's contribution to South Africa's investment strategy. So stick around for that. And the intra-Africa Trade Fair is currently on in Cairo, Egypt, at the International Exhibition and Al Manara International Conference Center. And it's under the theme Connecting African Markets. So we'll be in conversation with the CEO of the Africa Private Sector Summit, that's Dr. Lucy Newman, in the second half of the segment on the role that the private sector on the continent plays in driving intra-Africa trade. So quite a bit coming up over the next 45 minutes. But before we get into all of that, let's take a look at economic news that made headlines over the last 7 days.
U.S. Federal Reserve Chairperson Jerome Powell dampened hopes that the Fed may be done with interest rate hikes, leading to the JSE losing momentum gained during the week. Speaking at the IMF Jacques Pollock annual research conference in Washington, Powell warned that the central bank wasn't confident that it had done enough to curb inflation. He says the Federal Open Market Committee is committed to achieving a monetary policy stance that brings inflation down to 2% over time. September 2023 saw a 4.3% year-on-year decline in South Africa's manufacturing output, which came after a 1.5% increase in July and more than the expected 2.6% slump. This is the steepest decline in activity since last December and came after 5 consecutive months of growth as the country suffered the worst power cuts on record during September. The production of food and drink items as well as automobile components and accessories decreased dramatically. On a monthly basis, manufacturing output fell by 0.5% in September. Manufacturing production shrank by 1.2% in the third quarter of 2023 compared to the second quarter of 2023. Stats SA says production in the country's mining sector dropped by around 2% year-on-year as demand hit a snag. The number does not bode well for the country's growth prospects in the third quarter. On a month-on-month basis, mining efforts were down 0.3%, lower than the 1.2% recorded in August. Outlook in the sector also remains bleak, with metal prices lower and Transnet's logistics failures hurting mineral exports. The sale of precious metals declined by 20% year-on-year in September, dragged down by coal, gold, and platinum group metals. The International Monetary Fund has revised its GDP forecast for China, expecting higher growth this year. The IMF says it is making an upward revision to its earlier forecast of 5% growth to a slightly higher 5.4%. Earlier this year, IMF dropped China's economic growth expectations. The world's second-largest economy has struggled with high inflation, youth unemployment, and a real estate crisis.
Well, Gauteng may be the smallest in size when compared to the country's other 8 provinces, but it does remain South Africa's economic powerhouse, contributing more than a third of all the money that is made in the country's economy. And several economic agencies, including the Gauteng Growth and Development Agency, have been strategizing for the province's sustained growth in the midst of facing its own internal risks. And of course, that's including aging infrastructure and the rising migration challenge, and for a deep dive into how the GTDA is contributing to the province's investment strategy and the country's indeed. I am now joined by the acting group CEO, and that's Saki Zamkaga. Thank you so much for joining us. And I suppose let's start the conversation here with you just giving our viewers an idea of who the GTDA is. You know, when we do chats, we meeting at these global events taking place in Johannesburg, usually Sandton Convention Center and so on. But perhaps just give us an idea of who the agency is, what your priority areas are, and how you are indeed contributing to the country's economy.
Thank you, Ntokozo. The GTDA is an agency owned by Gauteng provincial government under the Department of Economic Development. So it's basically the entity that's supposed to implement programs and policies that contribute to growth, employment, and economic development in the province. So in essence, we must facilitate investments, put investments in infrastructure that has an impact on economic growth.
And as you just said, you know, you are an agent of Gauteng Province Economic Development, and you've partnered with several major economically charged events. As I just said, you know, we meet you at your BRICS, we meet you at your SA Investment Conference and AGOA and so on. And recently we actually bumped into each other at the Southern Africa Europe CEOs dialogue. And just before I hear your thoughts around, you know, the importance of being part or having conversation with these different entities, I did get a chance to actually speak to two former finance minister at that CEO's dialogue, which is Nhlanhla Nene and Trevor Manuel. Let's take a quick listen at what they had to say.
And so I think we must look to ourselves and ask how Africa will recover, because what happens on the African continent has to be measured in the lives of Africa's poorest. Every year during the summer months, a few hundred young, competent Africans drown in the Mediterranean trying to get off the continent, and sometimes, in spite of their background and education, are prepared to undertake menial work in Europe because there's no work on the African continent. It's a reflection on our failures. And so it's very important to read that together with enormous infrastructure challenges. Here in South Africa, the economic heartland in Gauteng, for instance, is landlocked. We need access to ports and rail. We can't continue to put heavy trucks on roads and hope that there'll be a different outcome. Similarly, the speed with which we can get digital access to the majority of South Africans in townships becomes an important issue. And of course, the ongoing challenge of Eskom failures. These will continue to retard the development of South African and therefore African prosperity.
That we operate in a very difficult environment. It's volatile, it's uncertain, and it's also, you know, filled with lots of complexities. And which then means that as you navigate these geopolitical challenges, we actually have to pay a particular attention to our challenges also internally. I mentioned the issue of logistics, infrastructure, as well as the connectivity, and then the challenges of energy for the young people, especially. Because we also, as I said, we refer to our youth as a positive, because if you have a youthful society, we refer to that as the demographic dividend, which means it's a positive thing. But the bulk of those young people are unemployed. The reason more so because those people, some of them, even though qualified, as you know, we have unemployed graduates in our country, even though qualified, but their skills do not match what the economy and what our labor market requires. So I think we need to try and find the right balance between those two. But again, we need this relationship between the private sector and the public sector to be able to create a platform and an environment for young people to actually gain the experience that we always talk about, and an opportunity to be able to, you know, come up with their own innovative means of actually survival. Because we can't always be saying they're waiting there to be employed. Young people want to enter the economic platform through bringing in their innovative. You had the gentleman who asked the question about startups. We need to create an environment that allows young people to actually come up with those startups and explore their entrepreneurial acumen.
Saki, quite a lot said by both Mr. Manuel and Mr. Nene, but a lot of it seems issues that we've been hearing, those structural economic issues, load shedding, dealing with logistics, and of course, youth unemployment. And for a province such as Gauteng, where a lot of people from South Africa and outside of the country come to look for those opportunities, do you share these sentiments just quickly before we take a break?
Well, I have shared their sentiments. They're both former finance ministers. They sit in very influential positions even today. I think what's lacking is what are they doing to contribute in dealing with some of those challenges. Because I think if there's anything about the last 6 months of the year, South Africa has hosted pretty much all its key trading partners or participated in those forums. I mean, we've had SAEU, we had BRICS, we had AGOA, and now in Egypt is the intra-Africa trade fair, and the continent is also one of those bigger trading partners. And I think the bigger question is what are we doing to make sure that those forums benefit the young people, benefit small businesses, and actually contribute to growth. So I think that's where we want to have a conversation and say what it is that we're doing from the province's side to contribute into some
Let's get into that a little bit. It
Yeah.
seems we do have a little bit of time because that actually flows into the next question of how you are engaging with young people and those SMEs, because I think that is one of the questions that I did ask some of the CEOs there of are we stopping to then talk over young people and entrepreneurs, and are we starting to invite them onto the table and let their ideas and their innovation also be part of the strategy?
So Ntokozo, first at a macro level for me, South Africa level, continental level, if you look at the amounts of billions of trade between South Africa, particularly in the US, South Africa, Germany, and the EU, South Africa, China, and other members of BRICS, and South Africa and the rest of the continent, where there's a lot of trade in between, cultures are similar, and in some instances we have customs unions and established trade relations over years. The numbers seem to be growing every year, but we don't see a lot more localization out of it.
Still with me in studio is Saki Zamgaga, who is the acting group CEO for the Gauteng Growth and Development Agency. And where we cut our conversation, you were getting into just some of the work that GTDA is doing when it comes to engaging with young people and entrepreneurs and driving localization, which certainly has been a key talking point.
Yeah.
Talk us through that.
So maybe just to use one example to put context on the localization. I mean, South Africa spends about 30 billion rands a year subsidizing the automotive sector on what is called the Automotive Industry Development Program. It's across the country. Some are in Gauteng, some are in the Eastern Cape, and some are in KZN. And if you had to decide where you put a rand, you put a rand on these original equipment manufacturers who are largely European-based, and we now have some that are Asian that have come to South Africa, or do you put it into reviving township development, reviving rural areas, and many others? So we've got to always look at how much of this is in South Africa, and currently it's very negligible. A lot of the OEMs come with their component manufacturers that fit into their global supply chain, largely because they have the scale and maybe they have the relationships and they can meet their requirements. But for what we are paying for them to be here, a lot more needs to be done. So we've partnered with some of them to do incubation on local component manufacturers that can supply into it, because it's not enough for us to be spending as much, and that is not happening. So we're putting that into the table. When we had AGOA, similar to BRICS, we met with some of the business chambers that are based in South Africa and those countries, looked at who the buyers are that are coming into South Africa, what are the things they're looking at buying, and how we can broaden the entrepreneurs that they can buy from. And interestingly, with AGOA, a sector that has grown a lot and doesn't benefit much out of duty-free because it's mostly services, has been the business process outsourcing. There's a lot of services they are buying in South Africa. Actually, in the last reporting period, it was $1.9 billion. So there are certain things we're competitive on, partly because of the exchange rate, but also in some, our skills are really good and at a cheaper rate than they would pay in some of the Western countries. So again, that's an area of growth. So we're looking at that and saying, how much of that do we localize? We have a company that's coming to South Africa, that's American, partnered with a local entity on business process outsourcing. That, again, is a benefit for this company because certainly it scales up, but it now has access to new markets that it didn't have. So those have been the conversations that we're having on youth. The Gauteng Enterprise Propeller is a youth fund they've done with the National Youth Development Agency. And their small fund, because it goes up to $1 million per transaction, but that fund, half of it is a loan, half of it is a grant. Because most of these businesses are startups, they're still risky, and they need a level of cushion when they start so that they're not over-leveraged. So those have been some of the things that we're doing, but the key anchor has got to be somebody giving them an offtake.
Yeah, and I suppose that cushion that you were talking about in that offtake is also particularly important for businesses that are in the research and development fields as well, where it does take a little bit of testing before business might get off the ground. And as you were mentioning issues around skills, hoping that you are working with, departments such as the Department of Education, because one of the businesses that we spoke to was in the medical devices manufacturing. And they were saying that the market for South African, products is large, is huge, but it's often, not necessarily a skills shortage, but that what is learned at school, and by the time that these young people get in the industry, there is some sort of disconnect there as well that happens that also hinders entrepreneurship. So hopefully we also, hearing some of those conversations around from the Department of Education, specifically in research and development heavy industries. And Saki, you mentioned something around, localization, reindustrialization, and the entire year we've really also seen kind of special economic zones that are coming out in the Val and so on. Could you perhaps talk us through the value of those special economic zones for Gauteng's economy, but also how you respond to some of the criticism that why are we spending on special economic zones when we should be rebuilding existing industrial zones that a lot of them are near townships?
Okay, so let me start with the first question. The real thing on what government has done with these special economic zones is what everybody talks about theoretically. Government must create the environment for investors to come in. And that environment has largely been building basic infrastructure. So you find places that are in the middle of nowhere, they don't have water, electricity, or at least in the bulk that's required for businesses to be there. And government puts in money, attracts these investors, and in some occasions gives them tax incentives for those that are exporting for them to come into South Africa. So the immediate thing is that it creates jobs, brings in investment that would otherwise not have come. But the real benefit is that you now have infrastructure in places which would otherwise not have it. So businesses that are close to it, residential areas that are close to it, can now plug into a substation which would otherwise not be there. There's now a water pipeline in bulk that they can plug into. So a lot of these special economic zones, actually, more than just them as islands, they create more economic activity on the areas around them. So that's been the biggest benefit. But what it then does, which comes back to the localization issue, if these international companies come and they localize because they came here because we gave them an incentive to come, which means their business cases are now a lot more profitable than they would have been with that kind of support. They then have a duty to give back to us in the form of employing people locally, giving business to entrepreneurs that are local, because all of the challenges we talk about, let's say the skills, I mean, everyone around the world is dealing with a world that is digitizing faster than we can keep up. Unless you are China and India, each with more than 1 billion people, the ability to replicate those skills quick enough is always difficult. You can go to the US, you go to Europe, they're all dealing with it. But give people the business, they will work backwards. If you've been given a business and somebody says, we need 100 data analysts, you may not have them now, you may get them into India, but over a certain period of time, you can train people because you now have a business. The issue always is, you train these individuals for whom? By the time you've completed training them, they're no longer relevant because, all institutions of higher learning can do is to give you the basics and maybe a little bit of a generalized training. But some of those that are really niche and are linked to certain requirements are a little bit difficult. We work with some of the sitters on doing the training, but we need business to come to the party and say, this is what we want, but most importantly, this is where these people are going to go. Otherwise, you keep, producing all of these skills you are told are not relevant, because there is no matching on where the requirement is.
Yeah, well, Saki, I still have a long list of questions, but time just really seems to fly. There's a lot to still unpack when it comes to Gauteng's economy, so we trust that you will join us again in future to just dig into, the importance and relevance of Gauteng's economy to the greater South African economy. And of course, that was Saki Zamkaka, who is the acting group CEO of the Gauteng Growth and Development Agency. We're going to take a quick break, but before we do, let's take a quick look at business news that made headlines over the last 7 days.
Creditors will have the final say on the proposed rescue plan for financially distressed Tongaat Hewlett. This was confirmed by the JSE-listed sugar producers' business rescue practitioners, Meta's strategic advisors. According to the advisors, businessman Robert Gumede's Terrace Consortium has agreed to buy the billions in debt Tongaat owes to banks and will have a majority vote on the business rescue plan that will be published later this month, as well as who will eventually buy Tongaat. The business rescue practitioners initially went with Tanzania's Kagera Sugar, which had offered 3 billion rand for Tongaat's operations in South Africa, Mozambique and Zimbabwe. Clientele has signed a share exchange arrangement for One Life Insurance worth 1.9 billion rand. One Life, a provider of life insurance products and burial plans, will be bought from its current owner, Teleshore Investment Holdings, through the issuing of shares that will account for little more than 25% of the combined company. This deal will create a combined value of around 7.8 billion rand, more than twice the insurer's declared market value of 3.6 billion rand. WeWork applied for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in the US and Canada to cut its current debt pile of $2.9 billion. The SA unit is 100% independent of the international company, operating under a local entity called Sisibenza. Major platinum producer Sibanye-Stillwater secured a 5-year wage deal with unions at its Krookdal operation in the northwest. The latest agreement will include annual wages and employee benefits for workers under the Association of Mine Workers and Construction Union, as well as the National Union of Mine Workers. Miners, artisans and officials will receive an increase of 6% in each year of the 5-year agreement. In October, the group announced that it was closing 2 shafts and restructuring 2 others, affecting over 4,000 jobs. To save expenses as the price of metal declines, Impala Platinum is offering voluntary job cutbacks to employees at some of its mining shafts in South Africa. The mining company initiated the procedure at its headquarters last month and is expanding the leave packages to its Rustenburg mine, located in the province of Northwest.
The African Export-Import Bank, in collaboration with the African Union and the African Continental Free Trade Area Secretariat, is hosting the 3rd Intra-African Trade Fair in Cairo, Egypt, and it's under the theme Connecting African Markets. And joining us now from Cairo for a conversation on the role of the private sector in driving this connectivity is Dr. Lucy Sohail Newman, the CEO of the Africa Private Sector Summit. Thank you so much much for joining us this afternoon, and I'm happy that we are in the same time zone, so I didn't have to keep you up. I think just to start off this conversation, as I just said, you are in Cairo for the Intra-Africa Trade Fair. Could you give us the relevance of this event and just the role that the private sector on the continent actually plays in driving inter-Africa trade?
Thank you very much for the invitation. Yes, I am in Cairo, Egypt, for the Intra-African Trade Fair. Myself, my colleagues at APSS, and all of us in the ecosystem. The trade fair is very good for African private sector in terms of trade fair is a marketplace for conversations and negotiations about services and goods.
Yeah.
So the trade fair offers an opportunity for that negotiation to happen. The African Continental Free Trade Area gives us one of the largest block market in the whole world by continent at 3.4 billion. Also, if you look at 1.4 billion people on the continent, that is a huge market.
Absolutely.
And it's very good for the private sector because most economies in the world, the private sector have been very influential in terms of the growth of such economies. So for Africa to have this trade is a very good thing, and it is actually highly encouraged to continue, and we're very delighted to be here. We are here also going to have a co-hosting event with the AFTA Secretariat on Tuesday at the fair.
And just talk us through then the roadmap that APSS is building on Gabi and, of course, the Intra-Africa Trade Fair as well.
Thank you very much. Yes, APSS was at Gabi. We were at Gabi with AETF, the founder of APSS, Mr. Wendell Adi, myself, the CEO, and then His Excellency Dr. Spio Garba, the chair of AETF, were at Gabi. And while at Gabi, we had an opportunity to have interviews, which are now on the Global Compact website, where we spoke about the roadmap. And at that Gabi also, we met the Secretary General, His Excellency Wamkele Mene, of the AFTA, and we discussed, and then later we spoke with the Special Advisor on Private Sector Engagement, Ms. Cynthia Gesime, and now we're here to have this session, which is really very big progress from Gabi, and we hope that after this trade fair, there will be other steps. And at the trade fair, we're also highly collaborating with PATSI, Pan-African Chamber of Commerce. As you recall, the last time I mentioned that we will be going around the 5 regions of the continent plus diaspora to share the Bill of Rights and get vetting and validation. So at this event also, we're going to test some of this Bill of Rights, about 24 of them, by a survey, which we hope that people will participate, and then we'll see how relevant those Bill of Rights are to progress forward to the regional engagements for validation and vetting, with PASI leading the way, and later at the continental level in the African Business Council, taking it to the AU Heads of State Summit, hopefully in February 2025.
And just to give our viewers context on that, it's the UN Global Impact, Gabi, that's out in United States in New York. And perhaps, Dr. Newman, just to give us then an idea of what those Bill of Rights are, just a few, and how, they remain relevant across the continent, and how African businesses can actually then leverage off this roadmap, but also leverage off this Bill of Rights.
Okay, thank you, Ntokozo. Yes, the roadmap is going to give us an opportunity to engage whereby we work. The Bill of Rights were actually extracted from the REC protocols and the AFTA protocol, which are currently in existence and are currently signed off by the heads of states. However, they've not been fully implemented. So we extracted them from existing protocols and brought them all together in a compact form. Things like liberty to have access to markets across Africa for legitimate businesses, issues of funding, issues of multiple taxation, issues of access to finance at appreciable rates, issues of tariffs and barriers to movement of goods and properties across Africa, issues of access to markets, issues of security. Multiple, there are 24 of them, and they are actually listed in the survey that we have, which is available at the registration desk at the AITF. and also at the After Pavilion at AITF and at Pasi Pavilion at AITF, and it's also on the websites for people, even at the AITF website. The QR code is there for people to scan and participate. Just want to check that these rights are pervasive across the continent, to analyze them by country. When these are ratified by region, when they're going to be vetted and validated by region, we're going to have a continental event which will happen in Botswana, God willing. That is a continental one, which is a summation of all the regional engagements. Thereafter, then Africa Business Council, which is an AU-recognized body to represent the private sector in Africa, will take it for adoption by the AU heads of states. Between then, as we go around the regions, we are also going to get, hopefully, minimum of 22 presidents who will sign up as champions to the rights. And hopefully when we get to AU, it will be signed up just in the same pattern that AFTA was passed. And for us, countries that have already signed up to AFTA, there are 44 of them. We'll be approaching them. Countries that have business friendliness in their perspectives, and also countries that have the citizens happy with the government in the office, and also countries that are also receptive to the private sector. We have a criteria that we use to approach, because we're not partisan. So therefore, we have objective 4 checklists that we use to approach countries. We hope that when we approach these countries, the presidents will sign up and agree. When it is adopted at the AU Heads of State Summit, then each country will take that as a basis for its engagement with the private sector. That's where the role of the Pan-African Chamber of Commerce, which is also with the regional business councils and the national commerce and trade associations, as also with the regional trade fairs and trade organizations. We will all take that in our engagement with their respective governments in terms of engagement with the private sector, especially when it comes to regulation. Some of our policies change suddenly, and it's a disincentive to investment, because most investors take the long-time perspective, have their calculations, and when these policies change at random, they throw these permutations out of sync, and business does not like uncertain environment.
Absolutely. And of course, with us being in this geopolitical environment that we're in, minimizing that uncertainty is essential. Just quickly before I let you go, Dr. Newman, you mentioned some of those bottlenecks, of course, that, ever shifting or ever changing policy being a bottleneck for business. Talk us through some of the other bottlenecks that you do experience across the continent that really needs to be worked on as a matter of urgency, in order for the private sector to really be able to take its rightful place on the continent and in growing the economy. The private sector is still a major employer on the continent, enabling of smaller and medium-sized enterprises as well to come up. So what bottlenecks, according to you, needs to be removed in the environment?
Thank you, Ntokozo. If we just take a look at the companies that are globally top 50 of them in terms of revenue in excess of $160 billion, there are 50 of them. All these countries, the companies come from America, Asia, and Europe. There's none among them that is from Africa. The whole of the African market in terms of AFTA is projected as $3.4 trillion. One of the big major corporates, for us, that is the combined GDP of an entire continent. Some of these global 1,000, global 500 companies have revenues and capitalization in excess of our entire continental gross domestic product. That is a big room for opportunities for growth. Now, in terms of even the issue of the bottlenecks, trade barriers, tariffs, for somebody to import a product from Cairo to Namibia or from South Africa to Angola, there are tariffs in terms of trade, there are taxes and levies, and also for movement of people. Visa processes are draconian across Africa. We can't afford to do that when people need to move around and trade. African trade intra-Africa is just about 16%. If you compare that with what happens in Asia, it's 56% on the continent within the countries in Asia. It is 30% within America. In Africa, it's just 16%. And we are the largest continental bloc in the world. That is part of it. Then the other issue is trade, movement of people. Our flights are not convenient to move from one part of Africa to the other. Somebody that is going to Australia would have arrived, and the person going to the other African country has not yet arrived. Shipment of our goods and services, especially for the SMEs, is a big challenge. And if you want to take the private sector shipping, it makes your products very expensive. Or if you're producing something that has a shelf life, we're very agrarian. And when you do processing and you have something that you're exporting, like shea butter and all those things, and it has expiry life of 6 months, by the time it reaches its destination, it's already expired, it's wasted. So these are some of the things that we hope will be addressed. The issue of visa between African countries. If I'm traveling from Nigeria and I'm going to Kenya, Egypt, and Ethiopia, I need 3 visa processes. Why should that happen? I can only take my passport and travel if I'm within the West African system. We need to have the AU passport become real. We need to also have our airline routes realigned. We need rail networks to move heavy-duty goods. We need road transportation, road network to move these goods. And we need convertibility of currencies. When I trade, I'm in Angola and I sell something to somebody in Namibia, I should be able to receive my money in my own currency without a third currency. So these are some of the issues, and the visa and ability to register, and also ownership of the enterprise. Many of our capital markets are struggling. The indigenes of these countries, they would want to participate in the capital market, but some of these corporations are purely in public sector hands. We need to be open to market, then we can capitalize that. If we do that, we'll be dealing with issues of employment, we'll be dealing with issues of poverty, we'll be dealing with issues of innovation, because private sector brings innovation, it brings capital, it creates jobs, it pays taxes which the governments need for revenue to provide the services to people.
Absolutely.
So what we're just saying at APSS is that in all these engagements, let the private sector be at the table. The bureaucrats and the technocrats are very visionary. They're seeing it as it is, but they do not have the experience. It's out of the engagement with the private sector that they complain about the educational institutions that led to the concept of the AET, the African Educational Trust Fund, to deal with our curriculum, so that it's practical, it's applicable, we can convert our natural resources into products that we can use within Africa, we can export to the world. And also vocational trade centers. Not everybody has a white-collar job. We professionalize the vocational centers so that the trade groups and the associations can be truly registered, be professional. If you're abroad and you're a plumber, you can be a plumber with pride and dignity because there are standards. And there's KYC, you're all known, you have a professional network that is strong. These things are very important for us to unbundle the awesome opportunities that we have in Africa. We're very happy that all being well on Tuesday, we are having a joint session with the AFTA Secretariat. It's a joint private session, and we're having a beautiful session on Saturday at the AFTA Pavilion in Cairo.
Yeah. No, Dr. Newman, thank you so much. And unfortunately, we have run out of time, but thank you so much for those insights that you have given us this afternoon. And of course, when you're having those deep dives into some of these business conversations, time does get ahead of you. So we have come to the end of this week's business wrap. But do join us next week when we wrap up all the top business and economic news. Dumisang Glovo is back with you tomorrow morning on the AM report, and I will be out back in the streets. We do have unemployment data out, so we'll be taking a look at that and entrepreneurship, global entrepreneurship coming up. So I'll most likely be speaking to some entrepreneurs and hearing from the Department of Small Business as well, just on some of the activations they are doing around improving entrepreneurship in the country. But for now, that's it from the business desk. It's back to myself.